the creator of mankind and womankind and all those to be born that are yet born. I want to honor all of you, your families, the communities you represent, because this is an auspicious and serious event that was meant to happen, foreordained before any of us walk the earth. So I hope I do my part. I'm going to try to go quickly because I'd rather answer a lot of questions because, you know, when we people with our blown up education, I mean, I wish it were something that just, you know, when you get a doctorate, in Canada I think education is free. In America you become a debtor. I'm one of those six-figure indebted American students. Should have stayed in school. But anyway, I wanted to talk with you. I think, if I'm correct, we're talking about hegemony and drugs. Now, I'm going to ask a question. I think the last time I checked, there are 7 continents. Am I correct? And 6 of them are populated. Which continent is the poorest continent of the 6 that human beings live on? Okay, some say Africa.
United States?
Continent, not countries. That's a country, not a continent. You said Europe. Okay, who agrees with... Someone said Africa is the poorest continent. He says Europe. You say Europe? Let me do this again. Which continent is the poorest continent in terms of mineral resources? Okay. Everyone that says Africa, raise your hands. Nobody did Africa. Okay, you 2 at the top. 3, okay. 4. So 4 people say Africa is the poorest continent minerally. Okay. South America? No hands. North America? A couple more hands. Australia? 2 hands. I'm doing this for a reason, guys. Asia? Okay, no, 1 hand. And Europe? Okay, wonderful. Finally, we get the answer. Europe is the poorest continent in terms of mineral resources. Why am I bringing this up? Does anyone have an idea of why I'd want to establish that Europe is the minerally poorest continent on this earth?
To establish who the thieves are.
Do you agree with them? I'm trying to go somewhere with this. Someone mentioned colonialism. Someone mentioned who the thieves are. Everyone's correct. People, the problem that we all have is that the dominant political, geostrategic, and economic powers of this world are metropolitan Europe, and they didn't get this power or this influence because they had a whole lot to work with, not originally. They got this power and influence because they were good at killing, stealing, and destroying. Sometimes through direct military conflict or occupation, and then in other ways, more insidious things such as attacking the culture, and that's where we're going. One of the things that's been used for the last 400-500 years has been the introduction of drugs or alcohol or tobacco as a means to undermine a population so resources could go from one continent to another. Are we all together? Let's take the continent of Australia. What's the language of Australia that most people speak?
English.
Okay, that most people speak English. Who were the original people in Australia? Okay. What is the condition of Aboriginal people in Australia today? They live in poverty. What is their main problem?
Alcohol.
Drug addiction.
Gambling.
Drug addiction. Alcohol. Indigenous Canadians, their main problem. Indigenous Americans, alcohol and drugs. African Americans, according to the UN, count as an indigenous population. What is our main problem? Drugs and alcohol. Are you seeing where I'm going? Let me ask you, did any of these people prior to 1500 have a relationship with distilled alcohol, tobacco, opioids, cannabinoids, narcotics? Yes or no?
No.
So who introduced it to them? Okay. Are y'all following me? Isn't it interesting that you don't have people from Africa or the Americas or Asia or Australia sending alcohol, narcotics, and cannabinoids originally to Europe? Why? Why? Why wouldn't they do that?
They didn't want to ruin their own society.
That's an answer. The next. Someone else have an answer for me.
They were the ones who were giving it out.
Okay. Someone's saying control. Well, let me say what I want to. The reason that you have the Europeans sending and making the drugs and the alcohol and the tobacco and so forth is because they wanted both to control, they wanted to conquer, they needed to undermine, and most of the rest of us were happy with what we had. The Aborigines were happy with Australia, the Chinese were happy with China, the Muslims were happy with the Dar al-Islam, but there's some people who weren't happy with what they had, and they needed a leg up. Now, do you agree with me or do you disagree? And if you have a contending opinion, tell me why. I'm not hearing. Yes, no, maybe? You agree. All right. I just want to do that quickly so we can establish the origin of this global drug problem breaks down to a need for control and manipulation and destruction of 90% or more of the world's population by about 9 to 10% of the world's population. Let's give an example. How many of you remember old apartheid South Africa? Y'all remember South Africa when they were, we want our freedom! We want our freedom! We want our land! Do you wonder what was the main means of control? A lot of you would think it's the police. You would think it's apartheid. And I'd contend to you it was called the South African Brewing Corporation was the most effective means of controlling black and brown South Africans. By the way, the South African Brewing Corporation was purchased by Miller. So now the same company, Anheuser-Busch, the people who have all the black folks and Indians high in America, have now acquired this. One of the major movements that was suppressed most brutally in South Africa, that was consciousness-raising oriented, was called the Home Brew Movement. The Home Brew Movement was a movement among black South African women who were tired of being raped, beaten, and cheated out of their husbands' wages because at all the places called locations, these are places where factories or businesses that serve the large companies in South Africa, Each company had its own liquor store or saloon to make certain that these black workers, after working all week, when they got paid, they walked right to the liquor store and gave their money. They weren't getting much in the first place, right back to the same people that were underpaying them. And the women of South Africa rose up and said, "We're not having this." And so the women began to attack liquor stores. They took these South African war sticks and they beat their men that were drunks. They were demanding that if you're going to buy alcohol, you'll buy the traditional South African homebrew. It's nutritious, you can get a buzz, and it's, people still got high off of it, but it had nutrients, it was traditional, it was a source of income for women. Guess how the South African government dealt with this consciousness? The South African government had tanks run over the black South African women to crush them with tanks, to machine gun them, because of the consciousness that we needed to cut down on the amount of alcohol consumed that was manufactured by the state. You haven't heard the story, women, of how important and powerful you are in terms of conveying values. Tanks against unarmed women. It's one story. You've never heard this in South Africa. You hear about Mandela. He's in jail. So women getting run over by tanks. So South African apartheid, its backbone is addiction. In the new, so-called new South Africa, where 80,000 whites own 90% of the wealth, 50% of the black population is malnourished, each month 10,000 children die of malnutrition in South Africa. These are under age 5. Even more die in the older ages. Are you following me? Yes? Once the old system of South Africa changed, then the illegal drugs brought in by the Nigerians, mandrax, weed, cocaine, now all of a sudden this neoliberal so-called black government of South Africa now has done very little to interdict the drugs coming in as a means of social control, because a teeny sliver of blacks are now getting some of the money that the whites have had and destroying consciousness. And so the movement of young black South Africans has more or less been shut down by drugs. In fact, in South Africa, you can lie and say you have AIDS, and they take the AIDS drugs, crush them up, and smoke it with daga, which is marijuana. Are you following me? That's just South Africa. Brazil, another white settler colony with a black and brown majority. What's happening in Brazil? Just at the point where, let's do this, Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country. It was the largest receiving country of Africans enslaved brought to the Americas. The Brazilians, for the longest time, said, oh, the population's just 10% black. If you believe that, you think George Bush is Jesus. Within the last 10, 15 years, through protest of some of the black organizations and others, now they have what's called ação afirmativa, affirmative action, and suddenly this issue of race and social injustice in Brazil that's been hidden by a veneer called democracia racial, or racial democracy, which never existed. You can't have a country with slavery for hundreds of years and suddenly have a racial democracy. Just at the point that these people began to say, eu sou negro, e orgulho, I'm black and proud, some of the cocaine that was being sent to me in America all of a sudden began to hit the streets of the poor communities on the coast of Brazil, called favelas, or bairros para as pessoas marginalizadas or marginalized people. And now the police have open wars with communities of color in Brazil. Just at the time that people beginning to get some of what's called consciência or consciousness, the drugs come in. Yes? Iran. I like Iran. I don't know. Are there any Iranians in here? Okay, I love Iran. I was there a few months ago. Human history changed when the Iranians had a successful Islamic revolution, and they tossed out this clown called Reza Shah Pahlavi, him and his wife. She was good looking, but he always impressed me as strange. He did, I'm sorry. I never liked him. And when I was young, the Shah had people come to Washington, D.C. and beat women and children protesting for freedom for Iranians. And the tear gas, they sprayed so much gas at the Iranian women and children that my school, that was maybe a mile away from where they're protesting, our eyes were being singed by the tear gas used on the Iranians. And I've never forgiven the Shah for having to buy Visine. So the Iranian people successfully set up an Islamic republic based on what they want. What begins to happen, in particular after 9/11, after the Taliban, which is always lied on by the US government, which had eradicated opium poppies, right? Now that the wonderful US doing nation building, well, I mean, you have to laugh when you're black when you hear about freedom and democracy in America. It's like, okay, whatever, you know. They're in Afghanistan looking for bin Laden, who didn't do anything. Trust me, he didn't. Okay, he didn't. I don't believe it. They can't make me believe it. What happens with the opium? They began to manufacture and make the people grow it. Where is the opium going now? It's on the streets of Tehran, Peshawar, Islamabad, right? Karachi. Why would it go to Karachi? Of course, to undermine the Pakistani government. The Iranians have the world's greatest drug interdiction program. Thousands of Iranian men have died trying to keep dope out of their country because Iran, whether you like it or not, Muslims, they're the roughest, toughest, baddest Islamic thing out there. I mean, my head goes off. I don't have to agree with everything they do, but they're bad. They're bad in the sciences. They don't take any mess off of Israel. They know how to throw the half the peace sign, you know, the read between the lines, you know which finger's in the middle. Iran has done this more successfully in 35 years than anybody except for the Cubans and Castro. So what happens to suppress this consciousness is through the American and British media to begin to send messages of discontent to the Iranian youth. And just when they begin to reach the youth who don't always understand the older generation, you have a 4,000% increase in opium production in Afghanistan. Do you know how many people have died from heroin overdoses in the last 10 years, people? A minimum number? It's over 1 million.
Wow.
Over 1 million. Over 1 million. Do you know another country which has sort of begun to find its way? The president, he's, you know, I mean, he plays chess. Putin rescued Russia from the neoliberal Zionists who tanked the economy. And what does America do? All this dope is going straight up into Russia, targeted at Russian youth. Are you understanding what I'm doing? Another country that's becoming economic and powerful and showing its ability to create and innovate, India. What are they now doing? Now the drugs are going to India. Are you following me? to go after who? The young, educated, enlightened, future leaders who are going to change the global order of the world. Are you understanding that you're world leaders, targeted? Do you understand that what comes up must go down? The French, the Americans, the English, they got to come down sometime. And they are aware of it. Who's going to bring them down? The new generations of other people of the global South who've been oppressed for hundreds of years. And they know that. So what do? The perfect holding position is to pervert and corrupt the youth. The most effective way is with drugs. Why am I saying this? I'll give you another example. You remember Martin Luther King? I have a dream that's deeply rooted in the American tradition. See, I can do that too. The Negro is not free in America. The United States has issued a blank check with insufficient funding. Right? And we had Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And you wonder, wow, black people after all these years, they're going to get it together. Psych. Our wonderful cocaine importing agency called the CIA. I hope you don't like them. I helped expose the CIA for bringing crack cocaine into black communities in the late 90s. I'm not sorry. I would do it again. Did my little part. What happens? When the African Americans between 1961 and 1969 had 500 major urban rebellions, right? Have you heard that? 500? Tens of thousands of black folks put in jail, leaders being shot. They needed to figure out what to do with these people. And there was a combo. They were fighting a war in Vietnam to get certain Asians to fight on behalf of American imperialists. What did they do? They made a deal to use and sell and transport heroin and opium to American soldiers and to the American people, in particular mine. And so what has happened to us? In the last 50 years, we've more or less stagnated. I turn 50 next month. There was a movement 50 years ago, and then the drugs hit, and by about 1980, we've been comatose ever since. We used to be one of the leading communities for change, for peace, to challenging the imperial and racist and militarist order, and now we've got Obama. Forgive me, I have to say this. Damn. What a letdown. I mean, this guy, he's bombing Africa. He's imposing sanctions on Iran. As an African-American Iranians, we're so tired of how we're treated. Whenever there's a country that's giving Anglo-Americans hell, we sort of like them. I love Khomeini. We loved Khomeini. I even wanted to, you wonder why I wear Muslim stuff? I had a little turban. I was like, I love this guy. And you just watch the people just go crazy when Khomeini would say, America can do nothing. I was like, yes! And Khomeini's dream for peace and for a third way where we don't have to be atheistic communists and we don't have to be capitalist, racist, militarist. And what do they want to do with Khomeini's promised generation, where the whole concept within Shia Islam, where the Mustafim, all of us oppressed of all colors work together? They send us dope. They send us Planned Parenthood, Depo-Provera. They're doing this, and by the way, targeting women, boys, because the future is yours. If Allah put breath inside your body and give your mind to conceive that you will be important in the world, then it will happen as long as you don't get deterred. So I'm speaking to you from a population. African Americans, don't trust them. They'll say there are 30 million of us. They usually do our number. It's like 20 for 30 years. Now it's been 30 million for like 25 years. Have you ever noticed the number? I mean, there are more of us than there are people in Canada. Our population has been decapitated by drugs. Just listen to the filthy music that's produced. You may like Lil Wayne. I mean, if Lil Wayne were a germ, I would probably see him as an E. coli. That's how I feel. I mean, if he has some fancy, I don't care. I knew Kanye when he was a teenager. I'm disappointed. Started out okay. There is a complete movement to undermine the morality. The two other speakers are correct. The virtue of Muslims is in the target hairs of a satanic Illuminati cabal. You're the biggest, most frightening thing because you're every color, every language, you're smart, you're everywhere. And when you really believe in the Quran, and when you're really true to the Sirat al-Mustaqim, when you're consistent with all of what it means to be Muslim, you fear no one but Allah. And this is frightening to racist people who've confused a lot of folks to want to be like the people who oppress them. The Stockholm Syndrome. Iranians, I love y'all, but I have a word for the ones who are ashamed of how they look. They get the nose jobs. I call them ninjas, nose job Iranians, because I think Iranian people are beautiful. And there's so many different types of Iranians. I mean, and forgive me, I'm going to digress for 1 second. When I got to Iran a few months ago, I thought I knew what Iranian people look like. And I got there and says, my God, this looks like the United Nations. Black ones, Chinese looking ones. And I realized, I don't know a thing about Iran. I need to, and there were so many different good looks. And yet, the power of this BBC or confused news network has, and I call it the British, I call it the British bull crap broadcasting corporation, has gotten people to think that if God makes you in the image that he wanted you in, that it needs to be changed to look like those who would steal oil, would steal virtue, and would make all of us slaves. I'm not going to talk much longer, but I'm going to challenge you to say yes to Allah and no to imitating the Western imperialists, the racists, the militarists. Tell them no. What made Western civilization? Islamic civilization, if you don't know. How can the originators go after the perpetrators? How can the creator let a fraud counterfeit be your reference point? The only reference point is God, no one else. Think of it. Now, so let's repeat this. I want you all to say, we're the originators. We're the originators. Louder, come on, y'all. We're the originators. And say, we're not imitators. We're not imitators. So let's do it again. And if we can keep that in our mind, that when folks didn't even know how to comb their hair in Europe, the hijab was being worn. When people didn't know what pepper or salt was, you had it. When they didn't know what silk was, when they didn't know what soap was. They call it a Turkish bath because they didn't have one. Be true to your roots. God made you as you are, who you are, to glorify Him on your terms within your faith without any compromise to anyone. I'll tell you 2 quickies and I'll stop. There's a link between drug abuse and oppression and the countering of consciousness when we feel inferior. One man that I grew up with was named Wesley Fenner. Wesley Fenner was half black and half Jewish. He wasn't wanted. And I'm not exaggerating. He would inject his own genitalia with heroin. This is someone that lived with me, and my father and mother got him off drugs. And you never heard that one before. Well, and we asked him, why there? He says, I can find the vein. Felt inferior. Couldn't be black enough, wasn't white enough. The man who took care of me for a while, my first exposure to someone shooting dope, was a man who felt that he's a good-looking, gorgeous man named Jaluk, but he felt he was black and ugly. And I remember the one day I was with him, and it's the first time I must have been 4 years old, watching him buy Blue Magic dope on Capitol Hill. And I was curious as to what happened. We get imprinted very early. Adults, you can't live 2 lives and expect your children to not drink, smoke, or do drugs. You've got to be straight so your kids are straight. If you're crooked, you'll lack the moral authority to tell them to walk upright. Just be real about that. Amen. And I recall following him, and he told me to go somewhere else. And I looked through the keyhole, and I saw him shooting heroin, and my head hit the knob, because I'm afraid of needles. And he whipped me up, and I kept it quiet. But all under the radar, always in church, nice. We've got to air out and find out who needs help and push them. He ultimately got off of drugs. But a person who looked white and a person that looked black with inferiority complexes being self-destructive. My greatest fear is that young people of the global South, whether they're Muslim or Christian or Hindu, don't recognize that they have the right and they're just as good, if not better, than anyone else. Are you agreeing with me? And if you keep your mind clear, if you leave the alcohol, if you leave the drugs alone, if you learn, talk to some of the older people, learn about who you are, what you are, you'll get so interested in what your roots and what your origins and what your faith is really about. You won't have time to roll weed. You won't want to be around the hash smokers. They stink anyway, and it troubles my allergies, you know. When I was a teacher, I could walk by my students and go, oh, and if my throat itched, they'd smoked weed. I got you. And if too many people had smoked weed, I said, I'm going to have a quiz. Okay, for you, I'm going to give a quiz. Let me teach you. I'm going to give you a quiz so you'll stop coming to class high. Tell them I'm not a jazz set. So, we can go on and on, but just very simply, there's a battle for your souls. There's a battle for your mind. My African American youth didn't have people do what these folks are trying to do for you. You should feel very privileged and blessed that someone's trying to intervene while there's time, because the storm is coming. Mr. Harper frightens me. As I said, he looks like Bill Clinton with Down syndrome. And don't be surprised if they start aping all the dumb stuff. I'm telling you, American people, the only thing they know about Canada is hockey and maple syrup. And a lot of them are not into sugar, so they don't use the syrup anymore. You've got to be strong to face what looks like a war in Israel between Hezbollah and Israel. They want a war with Iran. They're pressing. They may execute the Shia cleric in Saudi Arabia. That's going to go up in a big puff of smoke. This man, Obama, who I went to school with, I went to Harvard with Obama, and I never liked him. I only saw him once. No, I didn't like him. You can tell him I said it. Obama was giving a speech to one of the racist groups called the Federalist Society, letting people know he hated activists and blacks. That was my introduction to Obama. And people, he's in for 2 more years. He's got no morality. He pretends to be a Christian. I think he's Muslim, and he don't like Muslims, don't like Christians, don't like blacks. I know he likes Jews. They're paying. And if Harper wants to be a Canadian Obama, then the militarist move of Canada, a remilitarized Japan, a remilitarized Germany, my friends, it's on your generation to be more prepared. And you have the access to the universities to be prepared to be leaders. Wear your hijabs. They look nice. Trust me. And Washington, all the little weaves from the Koreans, they don't even like us in the store. And why are people buying it? Even my mom liked the hijabs I brought it back from Iran. My mother's one of those evangelicals. She put on like this. I told her Mary wore it. Mary liked Jesus. You can wear it too. We absolutely have tough days ahead of us. And the more desperate these maniacal forces in Western Europe and America become, these drugs, these wars, these drones, people wanting to give remote tracking chips, all of this shows what we call homeland insecurity, an empire that's lost its mind. And if it started off through piracy, killing Muslims in Hormuz, killing indigenous Americans, killing aboriginals, killing Africans, then maybe it goes down the way it went up. And so we need to be fortified, being sober in our minds, proud of who we are, because when you stand, God stands with you. No one can get on your back if you're standing up. God bless you.